My name is Ann Chin, 35 years old. The boardroom of Chin Industries always smelled like authority polished mahogany stale cologne and that faint metallic tang of ambition. I sat at the far end of the table, fingers poised above my laptop, pretending to take notes while my brother Marcus performed. The Singapore expansion project, his voice carried that smooth, confident rhythm that Dad adored, the kind of tone that made even mediocre ideas sound visionary. He gestured toward the glowing screen behind him, numbers flashing across a slide deck, polished to perfection. Projected revenues over the next 5 years will outpace our North American branch by 30%, Marcus declared, and the room hummed with polite admiration. Dad leaned back, pride radiating off him like a heat source. Excellent work, son. This is the kind of forward thinking your grandfather built this company on. I kept typing, though the words blurred. For all their talk of legacy, no one in this room had ever asked what I thought about the future of Chin Industries. Marcus clicked to the next slide. Phase 1 requires $85 million in total funding. Property acquisition, construction permits, and regulatory compliance are already in motion. Mom, sitting beside Dad, clasped her hands as though the family name itself were being knighted. Marcus, this is wonderful, truly visionary. And then, like clockwork, Dad turned toward me. Anne, are you getting all this? I know finance isn't your strongest suit, but try to follow along. A ripple of discomfort passed through the board members. Uncle Richard shifted in his seat. Margaret, the CFO, looked down at her notes. I smiled tightly. Got it all documented, Dad. Marcus smirked. Don't worry, Em. Not everyone's built for this level of complexity. Your consulting projects are valuable, too. Someone has to handle the small stuff. Laughter. Soft, polite, cruel. I didn't bother to defend myself. After all, no one here knew that my consulting projects involved advising 3 Fortune 500 companies and managing assets that quietly eclipsed my family's entire empire. I'd learned long ago that true power didn't announce itself, it observed. Actually, I said, breaking the silence, I do have a question about your funding structure. Marcus froze mid-click. Oh. He raised a brow, amused. This isn't balancing a checkbook, Anne. We're talking about international finance, real capital deployment. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. Marcus, your sister's consulting experience is extensive. It's respectable, Marcus interrupted, that patronizing smile tightening. But this is real business. Tens of millions in play. It takes gravitas to manage that. Dad nodded approvingly. Marcus is right. Anne, you've done well with your small ventures, but this is another league entirely. When you've spent 15 years in operations like your brother, then you'll understand. I forced my lips into a smile, of course. The words were calm, but under the table my nails dug into my palm until I felt a sharp sting. Across from me, Margaret's pen stopped moving. She looked up, meeting my eyes. For a moment her expression softened, a silent understanding. She knew what I wasn't saying. Marcus strutted around the table, his voice echoing against the glass walls. Some people are just born for the big leagues, he said, glancing pointedly at me. And some people, well, they provide support. The laughter came again, lighter this time, but no less cruel. I lowered my gaze and typed one final line into my notes, contingency planning none. Then I closed my laptop. Excuse me, I said, quietly standing. I need to take a call. Marcus waved a dismissive hand. Sure thing, sis. This is probably over your head anyway. The words followed me as I walked out of the room. My heels struck the marble in rhythmic defiance, sharp, deliberate, like the sound of something cracking. Outside, the hallway was empty. The air felt cooler, lighter. I paused by the window, overlooking the city skyline, the same view my grandfather used to stare at when he still ran this company. I remembered sitting on his knee when I was 12, watching cargo ships move through the harbor. Never let anyone tell you where you belong, Anne, he'd said. The ones who underestimate you will teach you everything you need to know. Back then, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now I did. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the encrypted messaging app. The contact name read, David C., Private Portfolio. My fingers hovered for a second before I typed, Need immediate review. Chin Industries, Singapore funding structure. Urgent. A moment later, the reply flashed on my screen. Available now, secure line open. I took one last look through the glass wall at the boardroom. Marcus stood at the head of the table, all swagger and self-importance. Dad was smiling like a proud king, watching his heir address the court. They had no idea that the foundation beneath them was about to shift. I turned away and walked toward the small conference room 3 doors down, the one with the lock and soundproof walls. As the door closed behind me, the echo of their laughter faded into silence. David, I said when the line connected, my voice steady now, stripped of all the polite restraint I'd worn like armor. I need you to pull up the investment details for Chin Industries, specifically the $85 million Singapore expansion. He hesitated for only a moment, pulling it up now. I watched the city lights flicker below. Somewhere out there, deals were being signed, fortunes made and lost. But none of them knew the quiet satisfaction of holding power no one believed you had. David's voice came through the speaker, calm and analytical. Anne, I think you're going to want to see this. The entire funding structure traces back to you. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Oh, I already knew that, I said softly. I just wanted to hear it confirmed. The door to the small conference room clicked shut, sealing me in silence. The hum of the city below felt distant, like a world that belonged to someone else. Go ahead, I said, my voice low but precise. Walk me through everything. David Chin, my investment director, had been with me for 8 years. Calm, surgical, never one to ask unnecessary questions. The Singapore expansion project, he began, typing audibly in the background, is listed as an $85 million investment through 3 shell corporations. All 3 ultimately trace back to your private holdings. How much of that capital comes from me? $78 million. The remaining 7 is from 2 minor consortium investors. Without your contribution, the project collapses immediately. I turned toward the window, my reflection merging with the city skyline. So Marcus has no idea. None, David said. He believes the funding came from an international investor network arranged through my firm, which is technically true. You're the network. The irony tasted metallic on my tongue. My brother, the self-proclaimed visionary, was building his empire with money from the sister he'd spent a lifetime belittling. What happens if I withdraw? I asked. David's typing stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. If you pull the capital before the first disbursement, the project will default on multiple contractual obligations. They've already paid $8 million in deposits and pre-construction fees. Minimum loss, $12 million. Potentially 20. Penalties, severe, plus reputational damage. Your father would have to explain the funding collapse to the board and to the Singapore partners. It would stall their operations for at least 2 years. My pulse steadied. I felt neither thrill nor hesitation, only a cold, mechanical focus. Through the glass, I could still see the boardroom. Marcus was at the head of the table, gesturing with theatrical confidence. Dad sat beside him, nodding with that same paternal pride he'd never once turned in my direction. For years, I had built things quietly, layer by layer, deal by deal, until my portfolio had grown into something formidable. Grandfather Chin had taught me to read market patterns before I could drive. He once said, legacy isn't about inheritance. It's about the leverage you create when no one's watching. He'd been right. I'd started with the $500,000 inheritance he'd left me when he died. I could have bought a house or a car. Instead, I'd invested it first into a logistics startup, then a chain of tech suppliers, and later into an emerging fund that went global. Each win rolled into the next until I'd stopped keeping count. But they had never asked. To them, I was still the daughter who consulted the quiet one who stayed in the background while the men talked about vision. I walked toward the conference table and ran my fingers across the smooth wood. This was the table where my father had once told me, business is about confidence, Anne. You have to sound certain even when you're not. Marcus had taken that to heart. I'd learned the opposite. Confidence didn't build empires, discipline did. David, I said finally, how soon can the withdrawal be executed? Immediately, he replied, the funds are scheduled to transfer Monday morning 9:00 a.m. Singapore time. If you issue the withdrawal before that, they'll receive the cancellation notice right as the payment window opens. And you're sure everything is legally clean? Completely. The agreements specify that all funding is contingent upon continued investor approval. You're the investor. You no longer approve. I let that settle. A simple sentence that could erase years of condescension. For a moment, something inside me softened. A faint tug of hesitation. This wasn't just about Marcus, it was about Dad, about the dinners where he'd praised my brother's ambition and changed the subject when I mentioned mine, about the years I'd spent trying to earn validation that was never coming. And David said carefully, this move will cause real damage, not just financial, personal. Are you sure? I thought about Marcus smirking across the table, telling me I wasn't built for real business, about Dad nodding like it was gospel truth, about the CFO Margaret biting her tongue while I swallowed my pride. They've been teaching me this lesson my entire life, I said quietly. It's time they learned it too. There was a brief silence before David exhaled. Understood. I'll prepare the documents. Good. Execute Monday morning. And David. Yes. Make sure the paper trail is clear. I want Marcus to see exactly who was funding his vision. He hesitated. You want him to know it was you. I smiled faintly. Oh, yes. He deserves to know whose empire he tried to lecture. Outside, the office was dimming into twilight. Through the glass, the harbor glowed orange under the descending sun. Ships were lining up ready to move cargo that my family's company had built its fortune on. For 3 generations, Chin Industries had believed control meant inheritance. They were about to learn what control really looked like. My phone buzzed Margaret, the CFO. You okay? That was rough in there. I typed back. Fine, just getting some air. Seconds later, your brother's an idiot. Everyone knows it but your father. That made me smile, a small, tired smile that didn't reach my eyes. David, I said, I'll send you written authorization within the hour. Make it formal. Understood. When the call ended, the silence in the room felt absolute. I stared at the reflection in the glass, the same eyes as my grandfather's he'd once said. Sharp, observant, unreadable. In 5 days, that reflection would be the only calm face in a storm they never saw coming. I reached into my bag, pulled out my laptop, and opened the document I'd been keeping for years, Contingency File Chin Industries. Every transaction, every holding, every transfer that tied their success to mine. I began to type the final note at the top of the file. Withdrawal authorized. November 9th, 9:00 a.m., Singapore time. The cursor blinked at the end of the line, a small rhythmic heartbeat. This wasn't revenge. This was arithmetic. And by Monday, the numbers would speak for themselves. Sunday night, 8:45 p.m. My apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of ice in my glass. A bottle of Chardonnay sat half-finished on the coffee table, untouched, since I poured the first glass an hour ago. My laptop screen glowed in front of me, the clock in the corner, ticking toward the moment everything would begin. At 8:50, my phone buzzed. A message from David. Withdrawal queued. Funds will be retracted at 9:00 a.m. Singapore time. I set the glass down, suddenly aware of my heartbeat. Not from guilt, just anticipation. 12 years of silence and dismissal were about to crystallize into a single, irreversible act. I stared at the city outside, the harbor lights, the rows of ships, the skyline my grandfather had once called his classroom. He used to say every structure is built on risk. The ones who survive are the ones who know when to walk away. At 9:00, my phone vibrated once. Then again. Marcus. I let the first call ring out. The second, too. By the third, curiosity overrode satisfaction. I answered. What the hell did you do? His voice was raw, frantic. Good evening to you too, Marcus, I said softly, leaning back on the couch. How's Singapore? Don't play games with me. The property trust just called. They said our primary investor withdrew $78 million. They're threatening breach of contract penalties. What did you do? I withdrew my investment. There was a beat of silence, sharp and electric. Your investment. Don't be ridiculous. You didn't. Yes, I did, I interrupted. You know those international investors you've been bragging about, the ones who believed in your vision. He didn't answer. That was me, I said. All $78 million came from my holdings. The rest was just a shell consortium to make it look diversified. You built your grand expansion on my capital, Marcus. You just didn't bother to check who was behind it. You're lying. Call David Chin. He'll confirm it. He's my investment director. His breathing grew uneven. This can't be real. You can't just Anne. The penalties alone will cost us millions. The company's reputation. Then you should have thought about that before dismissing me in front of the entire boardroom, I said calmly. You told me to stick to the small stuff, so I did. I decided to handle my own investments. You're going to destroy everything Dad built, he shouted. No, Marcus, I'm exposing what you tried to build on arrogance and shortcuts. There's a difference. Somewhere in the background, I could hear Dad's voice muffled, angry. He must have been in the room with Marcus. Put her on speaker, Dad's voice barked. Anne, he snapped when the phone shifted. Explain yourself. Right now. Hi, Dad. Always nice to hear from you. Don't patronize me. What have you done? The Singapore partners are threatening to sue. You've embarrassed this family. I exercise my right as an investor, I said, cutting him off. My money, my decision. Your money. He laughed short, disbelieving. You think your side jobs made that kind of capital? Don't lie to me. I'm not lying, I said quietly. I've been building my portfolio for 12 years. The total valuation, as of last quarter, is $847 million. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was paralysis. Anne, Dad's voice faltered for the first time. That's impossible. I assure you it's not. I have documentation audits everything. Grandfather taught me to manage risk, not chase glory. You remember how he used to say, let the others chase applause, you chase returns. I did that. Marcus's voice broke through, panicked and bitter. You're ruining us over your ego. I let out a dry laugh. That's rich coming from the man who mortgaged the company's future just to hear Dad say, I'm proud of you. And Dad's voice snapped back to fury. You will fix this. You will call your people and reinstate the funds. No. His silence was dangerous. Excuse me. I said no. The money's gone, Dad. The contracts were flawed. The due diligence was non-existent. Marcus treated investor risk like a minor detail. That's not business, it's recklessness. You're punishing your brother. I'm holding him accountable. By burning the family legacy to the ground. I took a deep breath, staring at the reflection of the city lights in my window. If the legacy can't survive one act of truth, maybe it deserves to burn. Marcus cursed under his breath. You'll regret this, Anne. You've made enemies you don't even understand. I understand perfectly, I said, my tone cooling to something final. For years, you've mistaken my silence for weakness. Now you'll learn what it really was, strategy. I hung up before either of them could respond. For a long moment, I just sat there. The city moved outside my window, cars flowing like veins of light, buildings humming with life. Somewhere, my brother was unraveling. My father was raging, and the empire they believed they owned was cracking at its foundation. And me, I felt still, not triumphant, not guilty, just still. My phone buzzed again. A message from Margaret. What did you do? Marcus is losing it. Your father just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I typed back. Just making a necessary correction. She replied instantly. This correction's going to blow the roof off. I stared at her message for a moment, then set the phone down. The wine had gone warm, untouched. I picked it up anyway, taking a slow sip as I looked out at the skyline. In the distance, lightning flickered beyond the harbor. A storm building, inevitable, powerful cleansing. I thought of Grandfather again, of his hands, weathered from years of work, holding mine as he whispered, Patience, Anne. They'll never see you coming until it's too late. I smiled faintly. Tomorrow morning, they'd see me clearly for the first time. The boardroom of Chin Industries had never been this silent. Even the air conditioning hum seemed hesitant, as if afraid to interrupt what was about to unfold. It was 8:59 a.m. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 9 sharp. Every executive seat was filled, faces tense, eyes darting between the doorway and the head of the table where my father sat rigid and unreadable. Marcus was beside him, tie, crooked eyes. Bloodshot, a man who hadn't slept and knew the executioner was already in the room. I walked in quietly at 9:00 on the dot. No rush, no apology. My heels clicked with steady precision, the sound slicing through the murmurs like a metronome of authority. Good morning, I said, sliding into my usual seat at the far end, the same chair where I'd been dismissed as the consultant little sister just days ago. My father didn't respond. His eyes were steel. We're here because your actions have placed this company in immediate crisis, he began. The Singapore expansion project has lost its primary funding, an investment you apparently controlled. I met his gaze evenly. That's correct. He continued, his voice sharp. Your withdrawal has triggered penalties, contractual breaches, and a potential $20 million loss. I'd like you to explain to this board why you sabotaged your own family. Uncle Richard raised a hand. Before we use words like sabotage, David, maybe we should understand the structure of this funding first. And can you clarify how you came to control $78 million of company capital? I opened my laptop and connected it to the boardroom's display. The screen flickered to life, rows of documents, ledgers, and holding company registrations filling the glass wall behind me. The funding was structured through David Chin Investment Management, I said calmly. Marcus approached the firm seeking capital for the expansion. The firm created a consortium of international investors, 3 holding companies, each owned by me. Marcus sat forward, his jaw tightening. You mean to tell me this entire time you were behind it? Yes, I replied, not flinching. I wanted to see if your proposal could stand on its own merit. It did on paper, so I funded it. His voice rose. Then why pull the plug now? You cost us millions just to make a point. No, I said evenly. I pulled out because during the last board meeting, I realized the person leading the project lacked the judgment and maturity required to manage that level of capital. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. Because I hurt your feelings. Because you treated due diligence like pessimism, I said, letting my tone cut cleanly. Because you dismissed valid questions as ignorance. Because you built an $85 million project on assumptions and pride instead of facts. He stood abruptly. You're unbelievable. No, I said, standing too. You are. You never verified who your investors were, Marcus. You signed binding contracts without confirming capital sources, and you didn't even read the contingency clause that gave me full withdrawal rights. That's not leadership, it's negligence. Enough, my father snapped. This is family business. We don't air it like this. This is business, I countered. You've spent years preaching professionalism, yet you let personal bias dictate who you listen to and who you ignore. This isn't about family, it's about competence. The CFO, Margaret, spoke softly for the first time. She's right. I reviewed the documents this morning. The contracts explicitly state that all funding was contingent upon investor approval. Marcus signed those agreements himself. My father turned toward her, shocked. Margaret, she nodded. I verified everything. The paper trail is solid. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table's edge. You can't just ruin people like this, Anne. You've destroyed my reputation. Our company's standing. I met his eyes. I didn't destroy anything. You just found out what your empire was built on, and it wasn't yours. He glared at me, but behind the anger, I saw it fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes his crown was made of glass. Uncle Richard leaned back in his chair. Anne, I have to ask, how large is your portfolio exactly? I hesitated, then said quietly, as of last quarter, $847 million. Every head turned. Papers stopped moving. The air seemed to leave the room. James, my father's old law school friend, stared at me. I'm sorry, what did you just say? I met his eyes, $847 million, across multiple holdings, verified and audited by Deloitte. For a moment, even my father's breath caught. His expression wasn't pride or anger. It was disbelief, the kind that breaks something fundamental inside a man who's just realized he never knew his own daughter. Margaret cleared her throat softly. I've seen the statements. It checks out. My father's voice, when it returned, was quieter, almost hollow. You mean to tell me, for 12 years, you've been, what, playing investor behind our backs? I wasn't playing, I said simply. I was building. He shook his head. Why hide it? Why not tell me? Because you never asked. I said the words, slipping out colder than I intended. Every time I tried to talk about my work, you patted me on the head and told me how proud you were of my little projects. So I stopped trying to impress you and focused on results. Marcus sank into his chair, face pale. You could have warned me. I could have, I agreed. But you wouldn't have listened. You were too busy performing for Dad. My father rubbed his forehead, suddenly looking much older. Anne, do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, I said. I've ended a project that was doomed to fail. I've protected my capital and exposed the risks you were too blind to see. He looked up at me with something between pain and awe. You sound just like your grandfather. I learned from him, I said softly. He taught me that legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt charged, heavy, and final. Then Uncle Richard exhaled slowly. Well, he said, glancing around the table, it seems clear where the failure lies. The expansion is dead. The only question is, what comes next? The meeting dissolved soon after, though no one really left. They drifted out in silence. Marcus with his head down, Dad with the weight of realization pressing on his shoulders. Margaret paused at the door. You know, she said softly, I think your grandfather would have been proud of what you did. I gave her a faint smile. Let's hope so. He always believed the truth should cost something. When the door finally shut and I was alone in the boardroom, I looked at the reflection in the glass wall, the same reflection I'd seen all week, except now it looked different. Not smaller, not silent. Power had always been there. They just hadn't noticed until it was too late. My father's office was exactly as I remembered it, a shrine to authority. The heavy mahogany desk, the framed awards, the shelves, lined with business books he hadn't opened in years. But today, even the room seemed to have lost its certainty. The air smelled faintly of old paper and aftershave, and for the first time, the space felt smaller than I remembered. He stood by the window when I walked in, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the harbor. The same view he used to show Marcus and me when we were kids, pointing at the ships and saying, "That's our legacy out there." Now he didn't turn to greet me. "Close the door, Anne." I did. The soft click echoed like a verdict. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He didn't look at me. but his reflection in the glass was enough. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his shoulders lower, as if the weight of what had happened had finally settled in. Finally, he said, I underestimated you. I waited. He turned slowly, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and disappointment. I've been underestimating you for a very long time. Yes, I said quietly. You have. He studied me almost as though he was trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman standing in front of him. $847 million. He said it like it was an accusation, not an achievement. How did you even— Grandfather, I interrupted. He taught me how to see patterns, how to invest instead of consume. I took what he gave me and built from there. Every decision, every risk, every reinvestment discipline, not luck. He frowned. And you couldn't tell me. Would you have believed me? He opened his mouth, then stopped. The silence that followed was the answer. I took a slow breath. Dad, you've spent years telling Marcus and me what real business looks like. Confidence, dominance, presence. But that's not what builds empires, it's what destroys them. You've been grooming him for leadership since he was 12, and in the process you made sure I never had a seat at your table. So I built my own. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. It's the truth, I said. You taught him that legacy is inherited. You taught me that it's earned. He looked away. You've cost us millions, Anne. You've embarrassed this family. I took a step closer. No, Dad. Marcus embarrassed this family. I just stopped paying for his mistakes. His eyes flashed. You could have come to me. We could have fixed this privately. I tried to come to you my entire life, I said, my voice trembling now, not with anger, but with exhaustion. Every time I asked for a chance, you told me I wasn't ready. Every time I offered insight, you told me to let the professionals handle it. And every time Marcus failed upward, you handed him another opportunity wrapped in praise. He exhaled sharply, his face tightening. He's your brother. I know, I whispered, and I loved him enough to fund his dream. But love doesn't mean enabling delusion. For a moment, he looked at me with something raw fear, maybe. The realization that the control he'd spent decades wielding had finally slipped away. You sound like your grandfather, he said softly. Cold, calculated, detached. He wasn't detached, I said. He was precise. There's a difference. My father's shoulders sagged. He sat down behind his desk, suddenly looking smaller against the backdrop of his empire. What happens now? I'm still a board member, I said. I still own my shares, but I won't fund another project run by someone who confuses arrogance for leadership. He looked up sharply. Are you suggesting Marcus be removed? I'm suggesting Chin Industries start treating competence as the standard for succession, not gender or birth order. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Maybe for the first time he couldn't. I turned to leave, pausing at the door. The city outside shimmered under a gray, restless sky. Dad, I said quietly, next time someone in that boardroom asks a question about risk management, maybe listen before dismissing it as negativity. You might be surprised by what people know when you give them room to speak. He didn't answer. He just stared past me into the skyline as if searching for the version of the world where he was still in control. As I stepped into the hallway, the weight I'd carried for years began to lift slowly like mist, dissolving in the morning sun. For so long I'd thought validation would come from being seen, but the truth was simpler. It came from no longer needing to be. Behind me, the door to my father's office closed with a soft final click. The silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. 3 weeks later, the plaque outside Marcus's office was gone. The hallway still smelled faintly of his cologne, but the space he'd once filled with ego and swagger was silent now, just another glass box among dozens. The official announcement said he'd chosen to pursue other opportunities. Everyone on the executive floor knew the truth. I stood by the window of my own office, the one Dad had once given me as a gesture, not a necessity. Now, for the first time, it actually felt like mine. The city below was washed in soft morning light, cranes, stretching across the skyline, ships, gliding through the harbor. The world kept moving. Even after all the noise, the arguments, the fallout commerce carried on, indifferent to human drama. Margaret stepped in quietly, holding a folder. The board just wrapped up the review session, she said. And she smiled faintly. They want you to take over Marcus's position, Chief Operating Officer. Effective immediately, if you agree. I looked at her, surprised by the sudden weight in her voice. Dad signed off on it. He didn't object, she said carefully. That's as close to approval as you'll get. I let out a slow breath, half amusement, half disbelief. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The same people who once dismissed my insight were now asking me to steer the company through its worst crisis in a decade. I haven't decided yet, I said. Margaret nodded, her expression softening. Whatever you choose, Anne, you've already changed everything. She set the folder down on my desk. This is your father's revised proposal for restructuring. He's trying in his own way. When she left the room, felt too quiet again. I sank into my chair and opened the folder. My father's handwriting, still sharp, still precise, covered the margins. For the first time in years, he'd written something beside my name, listened to her. I stared at the words until my throat tightened. The intercom buzzed. My assistant's voice came through softly. Anne, your Uncle Richard is here to see you. Send him in. Uncle Richard entered, his usual composure tinged with something like pride. I remember when you were 12, he said with a smile. You used to sit outside your father's office drawing charts on napkins. I still do, I said wryly, just with better margins. He chuckled. The boards impressed Anne. What you did exposing the oversight, forcing accountability, it was bold, painful, but necessary. Chin Industries hasn't seen that kind of clarity in decades. Clarity tends to be expensive, I said. True, he agreed. But you've earned the right to lead now, if you want it. I looked out at the skyline again. Do I? He tilted his head. Don't you? I didn't answer right away, because deep down I knew the question wasn't about leadership, it was about legacy. Did I want to rebuild the house that had excluded me, or walk away and build something new? Uncle Richard must have sensed it. Your grandfather would have wanted you to choose on your own terms, he said quietly. The words hit harder than I expected. I thought of Grandfather Chin's weathered hands, the smell of his tea, the way he'd whisper lessons between stories. Power isn't something you inherit, Anne. It's something you build one decision at a time. I smiled faintly. He used to say the ones who underestimate you make the best teachers. Uncle Richard nodded. He was right. After he left, I sat alone for a long while, staring at the harbor. The tide had shifted the cargo ships moving steadily toward open water. My phone buzzed on his desk. David, my investment director. New opportunity just came through. Tech startup Series B, 15 million. Strong fundamentals. Interested. I typed back slowly. Send me the details. But this time, make sure they understand their capital sources up front. I'm done with surprises. He replied with a simple checkmark emoji. I closed my eyes, leaning back, letting the quiet fill the space around me. For years, I'd thought power meant approval. That recognition from my father or brother would make me whole. But real power was quieter than that. It was the ability to choose when to stay, when to walk away, and when to rewrite the story altogether. The harbor shimmered in the sunlight, gold bleeding into blue. Somewhere below, a ship horn echoed a long, steady sound like a declaration. I smiled, tracing the edge of my grandfather's old fountain pen between my fingers. Being underestimated had been my greatest investment. And now it was paying dividends no one ever saw coming.